While the artistic merits of video games have become increasingly accepted over the last decade or so, for much of their history, games were seen as little more than childish diversions, and that wasn't exactly an unfair assessment. During the 70s, 80s, and early half of the 90s, games were primarily made and marketed towards kids, with consoles and publishers often associated with colorful cartoon mascots. It wasn't until we approached the turn of the millennium that big-name developers really began to explore and expand the narrative possibilities of the medium, and while titles like Final Fantasy, Metal Gear Solid, Shadow of the Colossus, BioShock, and The Last of Us are often deservedly singled out for their contributions, in my opinion, one of the most overlooked games in this regard has to be Remedy Entertainment's Max Payne.
The final gunshot was an exclamation mark to everything that had led to this point. I released my finger from the trigger, and then it was over.
For those of you who don't know, Max Payne is a game about a cop who goes undercover after his wife and infant daughter are killed in connection to a mysterious new drug known as Valkyr or V. Then 3 years later, after he's framed for the murder of his best friend and handler Alex, Max decides he's had enough and begins to wage a one-man war against organized crime, one glorious slow-motion shootout at a time. Think The Punisher reimagined as the lead in a classic noir film that was directed by John Woo, and you've basically got the idea. But while Max might not be the most original character, when he debuted back in 2001, gaming hadn't seen anything like him. Clinically depressed and racked with survivor's guilt, Max was a far cry from the wisecracking jokester or silent badass that most games cast you as at the time. In the classic noir tradition, Max narrates the whole experience, filtering everything through his cynical point of view, and as a result, the game is essentially a character study, offering a deep dive into his broken psyche.
At best, I was Superman on Kryptonite about to fall through a skylight, down to where it was all going down.
We know that Max is haunted by nightmares where he's forced to relive the worst night of his life. We know Max considers himself responsible for the death of his wife and daughter. We know that by the end of the game, Max doesn't really give a damn whether he lives or dies and just has to see his revenge through to the end, no matter what it costs. Max was flawed in a way that most characters weren't, and those flaws made him feel much more human. Of course, it didn't hurt that he wasn't out to defeat some ancient evil entity or repel an alien invasion. Most people might not have had their families murdered by junkies as part of a government conspiracy, but trying to find a way to put the pieces back together so you can move forward following the death of a loved one is something everybody has to deal with at some point. In fact, the bastard has such a bleak outlook that Max could almost come across as unbearable if he didn't also have a penchant for spouting off endlessly quotable dialogue.
He was trying to buy more sand for his hourglass. I wasn't selling any. I walked straight in, playing at Bogart like I'd done 100 times before. Collecting evidence had gotten old a few hundred bullets back.
And there's a good amount of comedy, intentional and otherwise, that helps balance the whole thing out and keep it from being completely depressing. The intentional comedy includes stuff like all the mobsters in this game being complete fucking idiots.
Take vampire movies. Why are they always set in LA or Mexico? They can't even get a tan.
Max is rocking up a body count that would make a war criminal blush, and these morons stand around chatting about how they've named their gun Dick Justice or how they live in Alaska if they were a vampire. Then there's the in-universe shows Lords and Ladies and Address Unknown, which are the exact brand of dumb, oddly specific comedy you'd expect to see on Adult Swim at like 3 in the morning back in the day, and I mean that as a compliment.
My lady.
My lord?
My lady, there is a matter of great importance I must bring to your attention.
My lord, there is?
The unintentional comedy includes many of the comic book cutscenes. Given how synonymous they become with the series, you might think that it was originally intended as some bold artistic choice to help Max Payne stand out from the competition, but no, it was simply done as a way to help keep development costs down. And part of the way that they helped keep costs down even more was by having the parts played by the developers and their friends and families, and it's pretty obvious. Jack Lapino is supposed to be this hopped-up psychotic mob boss, but he looks more like a wrestler you'd see at your local indie show, and the woman portraying Mona isn't believable at all as a cold-blooded femme fatale, giving off office manager vibes. For some people, this might detract from the overall experience, but for me, I just find the whole DIY quality incredibly charming. Max Payne came at the tail end of the Wild West era of game development, when the lines between AA and AAA games hadn't been fully established, and a major release could still feel like a passion project. And one area where Remedy didn't skimp was the audio. Obviously, Jane McCaffrey's role as Max is going to demand most of the attention, and with good reason. The man absolutely kills it and is a large part of the reason Max has become such a legendary character. Lines like "I don't know about angels, but sphere that gives man wings" could easily go from sounding badass to ridiculous if you don't have the right guy delivering them. Case in point. And everybody knows the Max Payne theme, which is one of the most beautifully haunting pieces of music ever composed for a game, but the rest of the soundtrack shouldn't be slept on either. Most of the time it's usually pretty low-key and at times more closely resembles what you'd expect from a horror game, but there are a few tracks like Killer Suits and Mr. Big that really amp up the intensity and sound like they were pulled straight from some 80s action movie. But the thing is, if you strip away all that, you are still left with what was easily the best third-person shooter ever made at the time of its release, even if you didn't give a shit about the story. From a pure gameplay perspective, there was nothing that could come close to matching the intensity and fluidity of the shootouts you'd find in Max Payne. And all things considered, it still holds up really well over 20 years later, seeing how practically every third-person shooter since Gears of War places a heavy emphasis on a cover system. It's always refreshing to go back and play Max Payne, which drew influence from stuff like Quake and places far more emphasis on mobility, which is highlighted even more once you unlock the New York Minute difficulty setting. When Max Payne is at its best and you reach that zen-like state where you're seemingly one step ahead of all your enemies and orchestrating a chaotic ballet of bullets, it's extremely easy to look past the graphics and find yourself getting sucked into that simple yet endlessly entertaining gameplay loop. But then occasionally an issue will pop up that breaks the magic. On more than a few occasions, I'd somehow get stuck onto a wall and would just have to wiggle my way free, and the fact that you have to manually jump over a lot of objects that aren't even shin high was pretty annoying. And I know that Remedy claims that on the default difficulty setting the game adjusts to how well the player is doing, but there were times where Max Payne gets brutally hard and some of these deaths just feel really cheap. Going through a doorway only to get one shot from basically full health by a guy with a shotgun off screen before you can even react is always gonna feel like bullshit. And anybody who's played Max Payne likely has not so fond memories of the drug-induced nightmare sequences where you're forced to navigate a maze in darkness by following trails of blood. These are easily the weakest parts of the game, and I'll be honest, every time I replay it I dread these sections. They bring the action to a screeching halt, but even worse than that, they're just so goddamn frustrating, which isn't helped by the fact that I hate third-person platforming with a mouse and keyboard to begin with. You can make an argument that any section that involves a character dealing with their trauma shouldn't be fun, but it's still never a good idea to actively piss off your players for extended periods of time, and it's clear Remedy quickly learned this, as the same basic idea is executed far better in the sequel. Looking back at Max Payne these days, it might be difficult to see just how innovative it was. After all, in the 2 decades following its release, we've seen games that deal with truly mature themes becoming more and more commonplace. Hell, we've even reached a point where a video game serves as the basis for one of the most critically acclaimed shows on television. But it's important to remember that just like everything else, video games evolve, and the process of evolution involves building on what came before. And it was developers like Remedy who took those first tentative steps into shaping gaming into becoming a more narrative-driven art form. I give Max Payne 10 bottles of painkillers out of 12.